Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Dark Sky at Dawn, Free Men and Dreamers, Book 1 by L.C. Lewis. And this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue. Calvert County, Maryland, along the Patuxent River, November 1781. A dank fog hovered over the shores of Maryland's Patuxent River as Jonathan Edward Pearson stepped from the wagon, awaiting the approach of the two men who would help him see to the painful task ahead. He stepped upon the shipping dock, the grand prize of the entrepreneurial cunning, and shivered as he imagined the frigid bite of the icy water. He wondered how long it had been before her muscles had cramped, before her once warm soul had become a frozen weight, drawn deep until her last watery gasp denied her a reprieve. He shook his head to remove her pale blue image from his mind and peered back through the grayness at his home, one of the finest in the infant nation. None of it meant anything to him now. He had fought in the 7 Years' War and the Great Revolution, seen patriots die while traitors prospered, burrowing invisibly into the craw of the new nation only to raise their foul heads some other day. None of that seemed as unjust or as agonizing to him as the news that awaited him upon his return from Yorktown the previous day. Charles Kittamaquund, oldest son of his good friend Chief Four Eagles, had come to his home and delivered the news. Nagadanaqui, Charles Kittamaquund had stated earnestly as he pulled Jonathan all the way from his house to the dock. Nagadanaqui. Jonathan took a moment to translate the Algonquin words. Leaving woman? Charles had nodded vigorously, thumping Jonathan on the chest. You leaving woman? It took several seconds for Jonathan to register Charles's meaning. My leaving woman? Again, Charles's head bobbed vigorously. I bring. She had been wrapped in a Piscataway blanket and laid in the tall grass by the thicket. Jonathan froze in his tracks, unable to believe the sight that set his body quivering. He knelt beside the body of the debutante whom he'd blamed for stealing his heart and tossing it back when he was still an indentured schoolteacher. Her once lovely face was river-swollen and as pale as parchment. She wore a blue dress, the same shade as the one she had worn that far-off day when she'd irreparably broken his heart. She's cursing me, he remembered, muttering under his breath as he'd scooped her small, stiffened form into his arms. The rustle of grass brought Jonathan back to the present. He turned and saw his black-haired friend emerge, dressed in buckskin. Thank you, Charles, Jonathan sighed with a weak smile. Is the Reverend coming? Charles shook his head somberly. I no see. Jonathan hung his head. I didn't really expect he would, he admitted soberly. The Indian and the British-born American unloaded a small walnut coffin with the initials SBM and the date 1781 AD inscribed into its lid. Let's dig here, near the dock where she left her note, Jonathan instructed. Before they laid the coffin in the hole, Jonathan opened the lid and stared down at the still face. I've dressed you in blue. It is how I remembered you in anger. Now it is how I will remember you in grief. He lifted a locket from his vest pocket and gingerly touched the engraving. SABM. The M added later was slightly different from the other letters, and one sad laugh escaped Jonathan. You made your point with style, my dearest, he said, slipping the locket back into his pocket. Then he closed and buried the coffin. You know our story, Charles. What would your shaman say if we were Piscataway? Strong lodges make strong tribes. To weaken a lodge is an attack on a nation. And what would the shaman do to someone who was a threat to your tribe? Send bad magic. Jonathan grew quiet. I've caused bad magic to fall upon our lodges, magic I cannot undo. Will you watch over them until when I'm gone and help bring peace to our lodges again? Charles's people were moving north to the Delaware, and to honor this promise he would need to remain behind alone. The Indian looked back at the anguished face of his father's friend, a man who had brought peace between the white men and the Piscataway. He was now needed to bring peace to two lodges, a full circle. He lifted his face to his friends and nodded. Chapter 1. Poolfont Estate, Baltimore County, Maryland, late June, 1804. Hannah was missing. Selma wrung her hands with worry about her master's 10-year-old raven-haired daughter. Before Hannah, caring for the sullen Stansbury daughters had been a miserable chore, whose only reward was that it was spared the slave woman from the grueling labor of field work. But the smiling, green-eyed baby's unplanned birth had brought Selma great joy. She glanced nervously out the window at the master and missus of Coolfont Manor, Bernard and Susanna Stansbury. Dressed in their finery, they stood outside their opulent Baltimore country home, greeting the stream of buggies and carriages ferrying guests to their annual barbecue. Such homes were more lifestyles than abodes, replete with social conventions as rigid as the lines of the brick manor house. To Selma, it seemed tragic that a creative, visionary child like Hannah was born unwanted into this particular world, where her nonconformity was as welcome as a weed in the manor's immaculate lawn. Hannah questioned everything. She was forever running out to the slaves' quarters or following one of them around to see how her clothes were made, or to lend a willing hand in the garden or kitchen. Day after day, Hannah's mother placed another item on the list of things Hannah was forbidden to do, or worse yet, for which she would receive another punishment. It was so today. She had engaged in the behavior that seemed to draw the greatest rancor from her mother. Hannah had heard the singing from the worship services held in the slaves' quarters, and her spiritual curiosity had lured her outside to enjoy the music for a few moments. As Hannah returned to the house and made her way back inside, her mother heard her singing one of the Negro spirituals. She dragged Hannah upstairs, shaking her at every step while forbidding her to associate with the slaves or participate in their ungodly music. Each protest brought a slap until the crying child melted at her mother's feet in utter submission. When Susanna Stanbury's small frame finally exited the room, her green eyes still flared and her graying auburn hair was mussed from the encounter with her child. While Selma scooped Hannah into her padded arms to calm and bathe her, Susanna and her two elder daughters, dressed in their gowns, ready to take their places with their guests. Myrna, a dowdy 20-year-old with light brown hair, scowled so frequently that her face seemed permanently pinched. Beatrice, 2 years older, was a mousy brunette with sad, gentle eyes. As Selma watched them living out their dreams, all she could think was that theirs was probably the only dreams coming true on the country estate, and she knew it didn't matter if you were white or black. Miss Hannah was proof of that. It was likely a hunger to live out her own dreams that had sent the 10-year-old off on a second escapade that day, and Selma shook with fear at what would befall her if the missus found Hannah before Selma did. Before she could clearly see the face, she knew the bouncing figure coming up from the creek was Hannah. However, there was something strange about the child's appearance that made certain identification difficult. As Selma strained to understand the dark shadows that obscured the child's features, another form, a boy considerably taller and more mature than Hannah, jumped from the most recently arrived carriage and ran in her direction, drawing the adult's attention. Selma recognized the expensive European carriage. It belonged to Jonathan Edward Pearson II, one of the well-connected but infamous Pearson clan. The beaming young man running in Hannah's direction was his only son, Jed. He was brilliant, charming, and handsome, possessing a wide-eyed face with full lips and high cheekbones. Selma knew the affinity the young man held for her master's precocious girl. It had begun at the barbecue of 1794, the summer she was born. Only 4 then, the boy was confined to a chair while recovering from a broken leg, and he spent the entire day inside with Selma, holding the wriggling infant. At that moment, an attachment began that had continued ever since. Though they saw one another only a few times a year, the handsome brown-haired lad had become as dear to Hannah as a brother. Nonetheless, Selma now cringed, knowing that Jed's attention to the child would also draw her mother's interest at a time when Hannah's appearance clearly testified of where and with whom she had been. Clutching a bouquet of wildflowers in her hands as she ran to greet Jed, she was a study in disarray. Her previously curled hair was now braided, and 2 dark streaks of red and blue were smeared diagonally across her face. Selma tore from the kitchen with the hopeless notion of snatching the child before her mother noticed the Indian markings. But the younger, faster Jed had reached Hannah first and was regarding her appearance with appreciative wonder that obviously delighted the girl. "Hannah!" He touched her chubby, painted cheeks. "Are you an Indian princess today?" "Jed!" she squealed in delight. "You're only 14, yet you're as tall as Papa." Her green eyes sparkled with pleasure. "Had I known you were here, I would have greeted your rig." He pouted and rapidly blinked his brown eyes to stave off pretend tears. "Are you saying that you didn't dress up as an Indian princess for me? Was this for someone else?" "Indian princesses do not wear blue frocks, Jed, but Charles Kiddick painted my face. He gave me a real Algonquin name, too. Kizisaqui. It means sun woman. Her last word ended in a gasp as an angry hand clenched painfully around her arm, twisting her small frame to face the fury of her mother's countenance. Hannah's smile vanished, replaced by a plea for mercy as Susanna Stanbury's voice hurled accusations. Why sun woman? Because you are an idol-worshipping and ungodly child? She spat. Hannah's eyes shot from her mother to Jed and back again. No, she stammered. Of course it is. What else could he mean by such a name? Hannah cowered and stood silently. Answer me, Susanna Stansbury demanded as she shook her daughter. Answer me. He said it was because the Great Spirit watches over me. He said he shines down on me, she muttered as each word faded into further silence. Susanna shook the child until the flowers fell from her hands onto the ground. Indeed, trollop. Do you purposely go seeking the company of sinners? This morning it was the slaves, then it is the savage, and now? She shot a disapproving glance at Jed Pearson, and his inclusion was not lost on him. Have I forbidden you to see that filthy red man ever again? Hannah was crying now. She glanced down and saw her mother's feet treading upon her floral offering. I went to pick you a bouquet to apologize for this morning, she cried. Jed could bear it no longer. The privileged boy stepped in and placed his hands upon Hannah's shuddering shoulders. By intruding between the mother and her child, the lad knew he was risking more of the irreverent talk that was frequently spread about his family. Nonetheless, he could not stand by idly without at least attempting to abate the woman's rage. Mrs. Stansbury, did you not purposely arrange this frivolity for your guests? My parents commented that your Hannah reminds them very much of our dear Franny. I imagine once news travels of Hannah's unique greeting, you will be the toast of hostesses this summer. Susanna Stansbury was quite sure she was being artfully mollified by the Pearsons' pup, but with the entire company of guests now focused intently on the scene, she temporarily bridled her anger. Without relaxing her grip on Hannah, she forced a strange smile and knelt before her daughter. In a voice intended to chill Hannah's very soul, she whispered to the frightened girl, This is the last time you will ever embarrass me. Do you understand, child? Hannah stood wide-eyed and as still as death. Then, feeling her mother's grip tighten again, she finally nodded a fearful acknowledgement. Susanna raised her voice for her company's benefit. Hurry and clean up, Hannah dear. Then come and join us so I can introduce our little Indian princess to the rest of our guests. She shot a warning glance in Selma's direction before spinning on her heels and departing. Selma rushed over to the child, who slumped into the woman's arms for the second time that day. She lifted Hannah and carried her toward the house, with Jed following close behind. Before they reached the door, Selma turned, cast him a look of warning, and shooed him away. I know you're fond of this little one, but you'd best join your family for now, Master Pearson, she said as she stared at the mistress's back. Then, wrapping her arms more tightly around the child, she nodded at Jed and left with the terrified 10-year-old. It took only a few minutes to clean and dress Hannah, but it took nearly an hour to coax her back out of the house. For the remainder of the afternoon, she sat as still as a porcelain doll. Jed watched protectively from afar as he joined the other young men in games of sport until later in the afternoon, when the men headed off to an adjacent pasture to joust, a medieval sport enjoying great popularity among Maryland's gentry. As the crowd hurried to the arena, Jed offered his arm to Hannah to escort her. She remained stoic as they walked, despite his best efforts to engage her in conversation. What's the matter, Hannah? All is well enough now. No need to worry, pet. Hannah's eyes brimmed with tears. As soon as everyone leaves, Mother will beat me. What do you mean she will beat you? He asked as he spun her around to face him. Hannah knew she had confessed something, the telling of which could only serve to get her in more trouble, so she raced away to stand warily by her father. Susanna's accusatory eyes followed the child, regarding it as an additional act of betrayal when Bernard Stansbury absently laid a gentle hand on his daughter's head. The child was his shadow the remainder of the day, nearly tripping him with her constant nearness, a fact that further agitated Susanna. However, she carefully concealed her fury, wary that as conscious as she was of Hannah's movements, her own were being scrutinized by the heir to the Winding Willows estate, young Jed Pearson. Jed Pearson was no ordinary lad. His notorious grandfather virtually snubbed his privileged family, naming his infant grandson the heir to the bulk of his powerful estate mere hours before he died. Interestingly enough, his grandfather's choice proved to be a shrewd one. Time bore evidence that Jonathan Edward Pearson III, called Jed, had inherited the best of his ancestors' business acumen along with his wealth. He had an instinctive understanding of the scope of his good fortune as well as an understanding of the responsibility it carried. From childhood, while other boys his age were reading the juvenile magazine or stories about Indians, Jed read farm journals until by age 14 he was influencing decisions regarding the Willows, the largest estate in the area. Thus, self-interest prompted Maryland's prudent elite to crack their snobbish doors to the notorious Pearson clan as they counted the days to the boy's coming of age and the moment when his wealth could affect their own fate. In this one area, Susanna Stansbury initially chose to disagree with her gentry neighbors. She had personal reasons for her reluctance to capitulate to the Pearsons. Though her reasons were not founded in solid facts, they were supported by powerful negative impressions of the occasions when the elder Pearson had driven his fine carriage past her childhood home and into town. Still lacking actual proof for her stand made her appear imprudent in the eyes of polite society, and she gradually yielded, considering it shrewder to know the family of her foe and to keep her opinions guarded. But Susanna noticed something more in the boy this day, the same cocky arrogance his grandfather had possessed. She saw the way the lad hovered between her and her daughter, while alternately flashing a mixture of scorn and fury whenever his eyes met hers. She wanted to walk up to the boy and slap his face, but all she could do was charge Jed's cockiness against Hannah. It was yet one more act of defiance and betrayal that she would address with her insolent child later. So the young irritant, the grandson of her enemy, became her foe this day as well. Jed had sensed the shift in his own social import as well. He was already more man than boy. His stature and carriage befitted a young man years beyond his age, and as if in preparation for what would come, he'd also been given a will of steel, tempered by an innate sense of right and wrong. Therein began his personal quest to understand the particular rancor the gentry aimed at the Pearson clan. Even as a small child, he had understood the prattle that circulated whenever the fine people gathered, making sport of smiling to someone's face before discreetly eviscerating him behind his back. Jed heard his own parents engage in the snobbish sport, but sensed something more derisive about the way Maryland's upper class tittered about his own family in their private circles. It was particularly so with the dame of Coolfont, whose animosity seemed acridly and personally aimed at him. Though he didn't understand the reason for it, he was well aware of the measure of it, and that it was cast as disparagingly at Susanna's own daughter as it was at himself. The social haggling for position angered Jed, giving him one more reason to adore his younger sister Fanny, a free spirit with little tolerance for the affections of the gentry. But his parents were a different story. He was infuriated over their posturing for the favor of the elite, seeing little disparity between their blind deference to achieve social standing and Hannah's pitiable overtures to win some measure of parental love. He also saw similarities between himself and the Stansbury's dark-eyed child. Hannah bore the weight of the world upon her shoulders because no one of significance in her life regarded her as valuable. Jed bore it because the family honor and name rested so heavily there. Understanding early on that he would eventually have the power to rise above the social fray, he had vowed to wield it, carry his sister and Hannah beyond it as well. Hannah's revelation today, however, had opened Jed's eyes to the immediacy of her plight. He pledged that moment to be her self-appointed advocate and to protect her from her mother. As the Pearsons prepared to leave for the inn where they would spend the night, Jed and Franny followed along behind their parents, adding their own parting words to the Stansburys. Jed bowed politely to Myrna and Beatrice and then stopped directly in front of Mrs. Stansbury. It was a lovely day, he began as his eyes bored into hers. Thank you for inviting us. Susanna Stansbury's only acknowledgement of the boy was a weak, wary nod of her head. Frances and I would very much like to write to Hannah. He strongly emphasized the point to Mrs. Stansbury before shifting to a friendlier tone when addressing her husband. That is, of course, if you approve, sir, though we would be heartbroken if you were to deny us this. Bernard Stansbury bent close to Hannah and whispered excitedly, You'd like that, wouldn't you, Hannah? It would be good practice for your penmanship now, wouldn't it? Hannah stared wide-eyed and cautious, but the delicious offer was too enticing to be squelched by hesitation. Oh, yes, and I'll write fine letters, too. I'm sure you will, he beamed Jed as he shook her hand and entered the carriage. He watched her mother's glare until the carriage slipped beyond a bend in the lane and out of sight. I can't believe her mother beats her, cried Franny as soon as they had turned from view. How can your letters help her? At the very least, you'll know she has a friend. In time, I intend to find a way to do more.